not surprisingly, I like a lot of what you said, but that doesn't mean I like all of what you said. And I think that towards the end you actually undermine your own position some with reference to the conceptual blending ideas.
Okay.
For the following reason. It's theoretically important to distinguish between multiple distinct adaptations that are the product of natural selection and the redeployment of existing mechanisms through cultural evolution and possibly individual development as well.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what the conceptual blending literature speaks to is the latter and not the former. Okay? So there's a fundamental problem with conflating big is powerful as a metaphor where it is a true metaphor, meaning that this is a conceptual association acquired either experientially or through cultural transmission, versus conflating that explanation of the big is powerful equation, for example, which is a sort of a standard one in the metaphor literature, right? With the competing explanation that that association is built into the evolved architecture of rank assessment in hierarchy formation.
Okay.
Those are completely different explanations, and when you start to equate conceptual blending with serial homologies as adaptations, then I think you muddy the water. So, for example, with regard to sexual disgust, people in the metaphor literature might say, well, it is a metaphor when people say that they're disgusted by incest. Okay, it's a powerful metaphor, and so it shapes their behavior. But it's a metaphor. That's a very different explanation than saying there's an evolved inbreeding avoidance mechanism, which was co-opted from some toxin avoidance regulation system, right? And there's serial homology going on. And so I think it's really important. That's not to take anything away from the power of conceptual blending as an explanation, but it is to say they're fundamentally different processes, because one says there should be distinct mechanisms in the mind independent of experience, or largely independent of experience. And the other says experience is the only thing that's responsible for that subsequent reapplication.
Let me see if I can answer that. Well, first, I was hoping nobody would ask me questions about conceptual blending or metaphor theory because I don't know a lot about it. But I think I can respond to your question by saying that in some cases the reuse that's referred to by conceptual blending theorists is held to be evolved by natural selection. That's one option that you give, right? Many other theorists, though, are interested in, like Dehaene, capacities that haven't yet had time to evolve. So written language, for example, or mathematical abilities. So in those cases, the reuse or serial homology interpretation involves developmental redeployment of existing resources, where these aren't fixed by selection. In the case of written language and so on, we could expect that sometime before the sun burns out, stabilizing selection will probably start to take effect, right? Natural selection and genetic stabilizing and so on. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, they make divergent predictions, for example, with regard to universality. Okay, so that if you think that that a phenomenon is best explained in terms of serial homology, that's the product of natural selection, right, then that means that every normally developing human will manifest that serial homology. Okay, but if you think that redeployment in the form of metaphor is primarily the explanation for the phenomena of interest, then it's going to be importantly determined by the nature of the language being spoken, for example. There may be some things like big is powerful, which will, since adults are always more powerful than infants, that'll be an inevitable part of the experience of all humans, and therefore can be expected to be universal.
Mhm.
But there are going to be other things that are going to be importantly contingent on the way that a given language represents the world.
Mhm.
So, I mean, to treat them as of the same kind is to, I think, risk failing to recognize the divergence in the predictions that they make.
I don't think that I disagree with that necessarily. I don't think that I have to disagree with that. I guess the one last thing I would say is that developmental regularities can also lead to universality, right, without natural selection. So written language, for example, can be cross-culturally universal, or it could be, as a result of particular developmental mechanisms shaped in the social context, or, yeah. Sorry, might not be a good enough answer for you, but I'm sure we'll talk about it later. Yeah.
I can first ask a quick follow-up to Dan's question that might maybe help sort it out.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like in Dan's question, he was presupposing that the serial homology model that you're advancing is an adaptationist model. But if I understood the setup, weren't you saying that through the talk we should not necessarily assume that a given case of serial homology is one that was selected for, but so that you had a sort of more encompassing sense, which could include ontogenetic things, or so you weren't necessarily. So I kind of like you guys completely agree, but when it comes to those serial homologies which are purported to be adaptations, then you couldn't draw on the conceptual metaphor and blending stuff as much. Is that kind of making sense?
Yeah, I was kind of trying to get at something a little different with the distinction between those types of function. So two serial homologies, homologs, could be functionally homologous in the sense that the one does what the other one does within a system or described in terms of bare activity. The adaptive function is the important thing where the second, the duplicate, starts to vary in different contexts. That doesn't, serial homology itself, the emergence of the serial homolog, or the divergence, need not involve any selective processes at first. It could be simply the random duplication of a developmental module or program leading to that, which, say, a given organism is particularly susceptible to, given their developmental pathway. Organisms that do have that duplicated perform better as a result of the duplicate taking on a new function, and again, that might be followed up by stabilizing selection at the genetic level.
Thank you, so that clarifies that. And a real fast thing just to
Mhm.
clarify is in the talk when you were going over the appraisal proposals for the differences in the finer grained appraisal structures of authentic versus
Mhm.
heuristic pride, I think it's important to note that this is something that has been written about a lot and theorized about a lot, but not empirically demonstrated well.
Mm-hmm.
There was an early study which had a sort of troubled methodology in which undergrad raters were looking at essays and sort of subjectively sensing if it felt more like an internal attribution or that was stable and so on.
Yeah.
And that Dan and I and our colleague Derek Piazza have been involved in an attempt to look at this with more empirical rigor, and we're not really finding it. So
Mhm.
I don't think that's necessary for your proposal, and we don't think it's necessary for the notion that there could be dominance pride and
Yeah.
prestige pride, but those specific predictions tied to that model of the distinct appraisal patterns don't seem to bear out.
I agree that it's under-researched. I was, or maybe over-researched, I was relying on Tracy et al.'s account, so I was just basically presenting their account. But as they themselves note, there's nothing in the display, say, or even the bare description of a person's actions that singles it out as hubristic or authentic pride. That, according to them, is determined entirely by contextual factors. So if you give a description of a particular individual as kind of hubristic, performing a certain act, you put it in that context, they'll see it as hubristic pride. Give the same description of another individual, they'll call it authentic pride. So that's something Tracy and Sells note. So I agree. These links aren't clearly established.
Wait, and that's the sort of external and an observer's watching, but especially with respect to the hypothesized cognitive appraisal within the mind of the person experiencing the postulated facet, one or the other. It's been repeated so often that it's often taken up as if there's evidence that for this kind of cognitive appraisal pattern, but I just wanted to make the point that there isn't.
Good. Yeah.
Thomas Schubert, who's in the back there, has done several studies showing that, which interpreted in this framework, show that when you get this kind of reuse or serial homologation, there can be still bleed over from one to the other. So if you think of hierarchy as up and down or big and little, then you can get either priming or interference effects, because the functional separation of the system for assessing rank and the system for looking at magnitudes and spatial positions is incomplete. So that it takes longer. Thomas has shown, for example, it takes longer to recognize the status, relative status of master and servant if master is in smaller font than servant, or if master is on the screen below servant, which says that it can be interpreted in two ways. One is, of course, we represent hierarchy as bigger and higher, and the other is that it's hard to distinguish sometimes. And it takes a little thought to figure out, it's harder to process when they're incompatible, because there's kind of bleed over from one to the other. I shouldn't really be speaking for Thomas here, but I just wanted to.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good point. You see that with disgust too, for example. People who experience extraneous primary disgust are more likely to morally condemn people in stories, even if those stories appear to have no moral content at all. So I think there you have another bleeding over between the ancestral and derived serial homolog. So I agree, I think that's important.
So when you get this serial homologation, or if that's the right adjective, the right noun phrase, you don't always get complete separation of function.
Yeah, I agree. It's something I'll have to think about more, but yeah. Yeah, Matt.
Sure.
Well, let me first apologize to you. I really wanted to get to your work
Cool.
on laughter. I would recommend it to everybody who's interested in this topic, but we didn't have time, so.
Well, the question's not actually related to that, so we can talk
good.
about it after.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I appreciate some of the conceptual work you've done here. And in your description of the process by which a trait comes to have homolog, you invoked pre-adaptation, the concept of pre-adaptation. And you also said that you didn't want to use that term.
Well, I evoked it in parentheses in quotes.
Yeah, right. And I would understand not wanting to use the term pre-adaptation because it's actually nonsensical, right? The two prefixes pre and ad are essentially contradictory. But following Gould, pre-adaptation seems to be a perfectly viable and useful construct for referring to a trait, the properties and the functional affordances of a trait before it's co-opted for a new function. And then, his kind of suite of concepts, exaptation being the trait before any selection has modified it for the novel function, and then adaptation applying after selection has refined the trait. So my question was just why you would be hesitant to invoke that construct.
I'm not hesitant to invoke that construct. I fully agree with you that that's what should be meant by pre-adaptation, but Gould's terminology is better for it. I mentioned it here, or stuck it in there just because that's what it's usually called. So to give people sort of a reference to how that's talked about in the literature. Certainly had no teleological connotations or anything. What I meant is that the ancestral trait is antecedently well suited in some sense for co-optation in the new context, and that's pretty much it. But I agree, I completely agree, although Gould's terminology never took off. I think it should be reintroduced though.
So use it instead of pre-adaptation in quotes.
Yeah. Good. Yeah,
Well, following up on that, I think that one of the implications of this approach is that the great weakness of any theory of natural selection is it always is, can't give you a good account of the functional constraints. It says, oh, it should be adapted to this environment, but what are the constraints on it? I mean, and you say, well, there's some historical constraints about the, what's already there, but that's just a lot of hand waving. And what this does is begin to provide you some story. It says, okay, well, if we want to think about hierarchy, suppose it tells you how hierarchy, dominant structures, whatever, that they're possible because we already have a way of thinking about magnitudes. And maybe communal groups are possible because we already have a way of thinking about the body and its boundaries and its purity and ingestion and incorporation and excretion and pollution and poison and so forth. And that creates a certain possibility for social relations. And those are the possibilities. That it's hard to create a whole new adaptation out of nothing. Evolution doesn't work easily that way. It's hard to develop a complex form of cognition that's emotionally laden, like an engineering plan where you start from scratch. But the possibilities that are there depend on borrowing these other systems, and then they provide possibilities, but also in a sense, those are the possibilities.
Constraints,
There
yeah.
aren't unlimited possibilities for organizing whatever domain it might be, but in this case, social organization. The possibilities are, well, the systems that exist, and then trying to find reuses of those.
yeah, I agree, with some of Dan's objections, to one side, yeah, I completely agree. Those provide, the kind of constraints that you can't get simply by, engaging in adaptationist reasoning. And a lot of.
Constraints and also affordances.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I would just follow that by saying, it's hard to distinguish in those cases whether what you're seeing are serial homologies qua adaptations or metaphorical extensions, right? That the clearest case of serial homologies, I think, are where you see, and Jason made reference to this earlier in the talk, where you see function reducing attributes that are intrinsic to the original adaptation and are retained in the homologous adaptation. So, why is inbreeding, why does it cause gustatory distress, right? It's completely dysfunctional. There's no reason that anything having to do with oral incorporation should be regulating sexual behavior in this fashion, right? You made sort of cryptic remarks in this regard to shame, but I mean, there's at least some evidence that running away and hiding is not the right thing to do when one is socially condemned. That apologizing, admitting one's faults and begging forgiveness is a much more expedient way of getting reincorporated into the group, right? So in those cases, I think one can make a pretty strong argument that these are naturally selected serial homologies. But in the case of how one thinks about communality, for example, it's hard to distinguish because it's not clear that there is anything like that trace that lets us say, yeah, that this is a naturally selected attribute, as opposed to some kind of useful metaphor, which is universal by virtue of the fact that both its utility and its source domain are universal.
Yes, on the other hand, if you find common neural processing, so for example, you find that the lateral segment, I've forgotten what the name of the segment is, but the part of the infraparietal sulcus that represents magnitude is also representing hierarchy, then, that's sort of.
I don't think that's compelling at all, because surely at UCLA there are neuroscientists who know exactly, the neuroscience of reading or mathematics or something like that. It wouldn't surprise me at all if it weren't the case that in all, say, healthy right-handed individuals, the same part of the brain is used in reading, right? That doesn't mean that that there is a naturally selected serial homology for reading. It means that the affordances that were there in the existing adaptations allowed for some culturally developed, developmentally contingent reuse of those neural structures, and so they're uniform across individuals in the way that they're deployed. But that doesn't mean that you're looking at a true serial homology.
Well, I think maybe it does, but let's, we can talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's, that an answer to that is really gonna depend on some of the empirical evidence about the way that these parts of the brain are used.
And what,
I mean-
what ages they emerge and
Yeah,
so
Well,
forth, so.
and also it seems to me that in principle it would be possible from the serial homology perspective to, for instance, predict that these areas that are involved in magnitude would also be involved in representing hierarchy.
Which
And
is
then you
what-
could
which
look
is-
in the brain.
Which is what Joan Chow did in her
Right.
study.
So in that sense, it would be more, if it were just deployed in some sense, then it could happen kind of, I mean, right? Or is that not true? It seems to me that it offers predictions.
It seems to me that metaphors have to be neurally represented, and they
Right.
must involve reuse of the neural architecture that is processing the source domain, right?
Right.
All metaphors will show the same neural signature in all normally developing people who share those metaphors. That
Right.
doesn't mean that the metaphor is a naturally selected serial homology.
Right. So even if you would be able to predict where in the brain it would sort of across people light up, it wouldn't mean that there would have been selection on that region in terms of, okay.
Now, if bigger is more powerful by virtue of metaphor, I don't think in this case that it is. I think it's true across vertebrates, and most vertebrates can't do metaphor. But if it were the case, which is the kind of Lakoff and Johnson story about that, then the part of the brain that processes magnitude should also be processing
Supposing
social
it's there
position.
before language.
Sorry?
Supposing it's there before language, then would you be persuaded?
Yeah, sure, absolutely, because I think metaphors are importantly linguistically dependent.
Yeah. So coming out in Science this week is a nice paper that Willem is co-author of, showing that 10-month-olds understand that bigger and above should go along with going before, coming first, precedence or whatever, already. And obviously, they're not using language.
It's not the
to do
same
that.
thing.
No, it's not the same thing, but it's
She wants
very
us to
close
start.
to it.
Okay, I think we can continue the conversation.